Hi, and welcome to Brainstorm, Changemakers by Timo. In this series, we're talking to experts, activists, and movers who are shaking things up in the neurodivergent space. My name is Bo, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Inclusion and Belonging Lead at Timo, a Danish neuroinclusion company that gives neurodivergent folks the planning power to take charge of their daily lives. Today I have with me Kirsty Cook. Kirsty is the Global Director of Neuroinclusion Services at Auticon, a majority autistic global social enterprise that's committed to building a more inclusive world. And yeah, for the folks at home, if you just wanted to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work at Auticon, that would be wonderful.
Sure. My name's Kirsty Cook. I'm the Global Director of Auticon's Neuroinclusion Services. I've been with Auticon 5.5 years now. I started as a job coach before leading the job coach team in the UK and helping to set up the Australian and one of our US offices before taking some time out for maternity leave. And I returned last January into this position. And the role now is setting up officially our consulting services, which means that we help organisations to be able to do what we've been doing for more than a decade, which is to be a neuroinclusive employer, ultimately. So we help them to understand where their maturity is at that point in time for neuroinclusion and hold their hands and take them on the journey for what makes sense for them. It's very unique from client to client towards improving their neurodiversity inclusion. Quite often we're supporting organisations first and foremost to support their talent they've already got. They're inevitably there, whether they realise it or not, who are neurodivergent, and then kind of working backwards through to that retention piece and how they're attracting neurodivergent talent. But we're very flexible in the way that we do things, and the type of services and the products we give to a client is all completely tailored to them. So, and on a personal front, I have ADHD myself. It took me 4 years at Auticon before I realised. So just in May 2022, I was actually doing some research about ADHD in females in particular. And I started to watch some lived experience videos and realised that a lot of these women were kind of playing back my life and experiences. So things started to piece together. And then I was officially diagnosed with ADHD in December. And yes, what else? I have a husband and a Labradoodle called Max and a 2.5-year-old called Grace as well. That's me.
Incredible. I've obviously done a little bit of research on you and your background, and I'd love to, you have a really interesting and varied background. And I'm just wondering what led you to the work that you do today? What led you to Auticon?
I mean, the answer to the variety is, ADHD made me do it pretty much. And I realise why. My background was actually in journalism. That's what my degree was in. I found myself in Moldova and Ukraine at one point researching sex trafficking because there was a great level of impulsivity and sense of justice. And I did Erasmus. I lived in Copenhagen for a while and worked at Neuroinclusion, if you can understand that, my Danish, Neuroinclusion 17. And while I was working there, I actually got talking to a couple of guys who work for a company related to the Financial Times. So at the time, as wanting to be a journalist, the starry eyes were going, and I moved back home, and I was leading on content development, financial services, analysing lots of trends across industries, across countries for mergers and acquisitions, and leading that for London, Hong Kong, and New York. I did that for about 5 years until I ultimately got a bit bored. It wasn't a challenge anymore. And went into PR and realised while in that, I took a role that was very senior compared to what I'd been doing before when I hadn't been in a PR agency, and was having quite a lot of anxiety and panic attacks in 2016. So it ended up being, I handed in my notice without a role to go to, but I knew that I wanted to re-steer my ship towards coaching and supporting mental health. So I'd been coaching in the background anyway, and kind of pulled myself out of what I was feeling and the anxiety at that point. And the role of job coach at Auticon came up. So I came at this from a very, very different angle to a lot of our coaches who come in with quite an extensive psychology background, clinical psychology, working with autistic, whether it's like children, schools, adults, but working with autism. But my route was wanting to help people with their mental health. And inherently, for somebody that's on the spectrum or neurodivergent, anxiety and depression is very commonly hand in hand. But it was within a very short period of time being there, I realised I've got several family members who are on the spectrum. I didn't understand at the time why it was so natural to me to understand the people I was speaking to, and to empathise and just be able to help them quite easily. And that was because we were sharing some common traits, and it worked very well, even if I didn't know it at the time. Yeah.
Cool. I'm also wondering, what the spark for creating Audicon's neuroinclusion services was, and, what needs you identified that these services were kind of designed to meet.
Yeah, so in the UK, we're very... we're that bit further ahead with awareness and understanding of neurodiversity and specifically neurodiversity in the workplace than other countries. 3 to 4 years ago in particular, the conversation started shifting. So the clients we were talking to, they were clients because they had our autistic technology consultants working with them. So they could see the value add, they could see the benefits. We've broken down the stereotypes and the myths that they had and their preconceptions before they started working with them. And so they then were coming to us, and there was kind of two situations where people were being more proactive. And the first one was they were coming to us and saying, I want to do this for myself. How do I hire more neurodivergent talent? There was and is a lot of conversation at that point about the strengths and the benefits of neurodivergent people and autistic people in particular at that point. And a lot of organisations, of course, have a huge skills gap, particularly in technology. So they were looking for that extra route to be able to hire the people that they needed. But unfortunately, the second scenario was realising that they do in fact already work with neurodivergent talent, because people were coming to us with crisis situations, unfortunately, where neurodivergent people were working, they were burning out, they weren't in a neuroinclusive environment, and it reached breaking point ultimately. So managers and HR teams were coming to us for job coaching support to help those individuals, but their managers as well, to steer things back on track. People were starting to feel more comfortable and open to share that they identify as neurodivergent or they're going through a diagnosis. And at that point, HR teams and D&I and managers were just very scared, ultimately, and very fearful, because they didn't know what to do. They didn't know the right thing to say and the right approach to make sure that person was getting the support that they needed. And so that was the other situation they'd commonly come to us. So Neuroinclusion Services it's been born out of a need, ultimately, and a need that we didn't assume, but we heard directly from people seeking help and asking how to do it.
You also shared that you're a majority autistic organization, and I'm wondering what percentage of your workforce is actually neurodivergent, and what percentage of your management is neurodivergent as well?
The figure for globally, so we're a global organisation, worldwide we've got 80% of people identify as neurodivergent at Auticon. I don't have any figures for the management team. There are a few of us that identify as neurodivergent, and that's open. There may be others that haven't shared or don't realise it, and that's just included in the overall data. Yeah.
And how do you create kind of a neuro-inclusive working environment for those 80+% of your workforce?
There's lots that we do and that we recommend to our clients on how to do it. But I think there's a couple of things that's important to remember that you can kind of take on as values and a very practical based way of approaching being neuroinclusive. And the first one is to remember that it's not static. You don't suddenly put in lots of different accommodations and different ways of working and then you can tick the box and say you're neuroinclusive. It changes a lot, even at Auticon, because ultimately the people we're working with are different from person to person. Different people that we're hiring, they'll be in different challenges and positions in their career that they might not have dealt with before, and maybe even that we haven't dealt with, so we have to respond accordingly. And an example of that is, when I mentioned earlier, we do a kind of maturity rating for our organisations to understand where they're at right now and where we can be going. And the highest level somebody can get is 4, which is optimising. And Auticon would 100% still be there. It's, we're still always looking at different things and different approaches we can do to improve our neuroinclusion. But the way that we do that is, I think it's very automatic for us to look at everything we do from a neuroinclusion lens first and foremost. We don't have anything that's specifically for neurodivergent people and specifically for non-neurodivergent people. It's all the same. We're all just employees at Auticon. And it's done with a kind of universal design approach. So as far as possible, we take on that neurodivergent lens, and we ultimately want to have the biggest, most positive impact for the majority of people. And by doing that, it inevitably is positive for anybody else that isn't neurodivergent at the same time. And a lot of things that we put in place for Auticon and with our clients, when you mention it to people that you don't have a diagnosis or don't identify as anything, they just say, yeah, I'd find that really helpful to do anyway. Yeah. It's taking that approach, but then there are obviously things that come up that are very, very specific to an individual. So while we go down the route of universal design, it's with the acknowledgement that we need to be flexible and human-centered and just really understand the individual and what's going on for them and what their needs are. An example is, if we were doing a workplace assessment with a client and we could see they had very nice, new, but very loud hand dryers in all of their bathrooms, we wouldn't suggest you need to take all of those out, because for people with sensory needs, that's going to be really challenging. It would be about implementing alternatives and making sure there's still somewhere that's just as comfortable and inclusive for them to go, or options like hand towels in the bathroom at the same time. It's, as I say, universal, flexible, and trying to help the majority rather than the minority.
I love that. That's also the approach we take at TIMO, just creating things that are neuroinclusive, but then they, work for visual thinkers, they work for anyone who, resonates with the tools that we've created. So I love that. Cool.
Yeah, it's simpler as well, honestly. If as I said, definitely more inclusive rather than creating silos of what's inclusive for neurodivergent people and so on. But if you think a business that has thousands upon thousands of employees, it's unreasonable to expect them to put in lots of individual things. That's up to the manager to understand their employees.
And then how do you work with organizations to help them become more neuroinclusive?
It really varies. We've got lots of services that we offer, like training, coaching, maturity assessment. And the first stage, the first starting point will vary from client to client depending on what their needs are and what their challenges are at any given point. But in the absolute ideal world, we start with doing a neuroinclusion maturity assessment. And the value of that is we help the client as well as ourselves to understand what's going on in terms of neuroinclusion at every stage of the employee life cycle. So it's attraction, your recruitment, your onboarding, and your retention pieces. And it wouldn't be right for us to assume things about the organisation, even though there are definitely things we can assume most people don't do. But it's a very, very data-driven approach, both on the qualitative and quantitative, to understand what they're doing well, where the gaps are, what they're doing, but we could probably improve, where the inconsistencies are, maybe within particular teams that we might need to focus on and work with more so than others. And so it helps us to understand what it is we need to do to be able to help and improve that client, but also where to start. That is the age-old question of we know we've got work to do, but where do we go from here? And depending on the maturity states that come out and the results, we work with the client to understand where they're at on everything else strategically and with D&I in particular, so that we can complement and boost what they're doing, not add workload to D&I and HR teams and management teams. We know everyone is very time poor and stretched right now. And to be sticky and to make sure that your neuroinclusion is actually sustainable, we need to make sure that it makes sense and is sustainable for them strategically. So then we design a pathway plan and work with the client on the timings of that, what makes sense, what they're, as I say, what they're doing, what we can make the most of and boost, and what the priorities are. So if we know that a client's priority is they're reviewing everything that they're doing about onboarding because they've been having a lot of feedback that's quite negative and people are having very poor experiences. Based on what we've learned from our maturity assessment, we could work to complement what they're doing with onboarding before, say, recruitment, because they've also got recruitment goals. So the same way that we try to be neuroinclusive and work with our neurodivergent colleagues, we do the exact same thing with our clients. So again, taking on that universal approach and being as flexible as we can. And everything that we do, services and product wise, we at Auticon have ultimately been the guinea pigs for 10 years, and it's all based on what we know and what we've been doing. There's a lot of expertise in-house, but the most important thing is we've been and we are a profitable business. We know what it's like to manage D&I and inclusion and strategic goals at the same side as there's commercial goals and targets to achieve at the same time. So we use all of that experience to share with our clients and help them not to make the mistakes that we have and to learn from the successes that we've had as well.
Incredible. Yeah, I love this idea of, also helping folks, because it can feel really overwhelming to get started on this work. And so to have an expert come in that's had this much experience must be really comforting for the organizations that you're working with. So
yeah,
really cool.
Yeah.
I'm wondering too what the benefits are of tapping into the neurodivergent talent pool, and also what the challenges may be.
Yeah, for each different condition, there's various different benefits and strengths that come from that. But I think the important thing is to be mindful, or everyone to be mindful, that if somebody's neurodivergent, it doesn't mean they're superhuman. You're getting rid of the Rain Man example, and remembering as well that these benefits and the strengths really, really do shine when the challenges are supported and when they are ultimately in a safe, neuroinclusive environment as far as possible. It is very, very difficult for somebody that's neurodivergent to show their strengths and thrive in the workplace based on those strengths, like creativity, having a different approach to solving a problem, pattern recognition, attention to detail, and so on. Sometimes that's very difficult to come through if they are generally struggling because of the noise in the workplace, or because of the type of communication with their manager, or just from having to hide their neurodivergent traits every day. So my kind of advice to other organizations is to really kind of help yourselves to see those benefits by creating more of a neuroinclusive organization first and foremost, and reducing those challenges. And I think one way to do that is start to be uncomfortable with having what would be one day a comfortable conversation. At the beginning, it's very difficult, but being okay to ask somebody what their needs are, and listening to what's going on for them, and being okay that you don't have to have all the answers right away, but just asking the right questions is helpful. Is a huge step forward to then be able to see those benefits. There's one example in particular that a lot of clients raise is people with ADHD in their teams are coming across maybe as quite rude, maybe a bit abrasive, that they're interrupting a lot in meetings. The type of communication that's going on between them and other colleagues isn't going as the way that they would like. And I would just ask, have you given this feedback? And the question is always no. They're too worried and too scared, and they're too fearful, and you can't know what you don't know. But unfortunately, it's therefore these challenges that are honed in on, and the actual strengths of how good that person is at their job is just completely missed, just because that conversation feels a little bit too difficult. So that's one really big thing we work with most organizations on, is just being able to start to have these very simple but very scary conversations for some of them. Just purely and simply so that we can help them then build in a strengths-based model and identify what's going really well for somebody.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and then how do you pitch the unique assets of your neurodivergent workforce in your consulting services to the clients that you're working with without, maybe coming off as tokenizing?
It's a really interesting question, because I can see how tokenizing can be thought about and assumed with the way that we do things with our technology consultants. But honestly, it's not been a big thought from us, because we just don't do it and just haven't seen it like that. And we at Auticon, we set out, and I think this is part of the Auticon story that helps with this, because the goal was always to reduce unemployment of autistic people. So we directly hire autistic talent. They have a full-time salary, and they're hired in the same way as any other technology consultancy does. Actually, it's the same business model. And because it is the same business model, and there's we have a neuroinclusive environment and way of working, but there's nothing that is outwardly done only because it's neurodivergence that we're working with. That I think is heard by the community as well, most importantly, and obviously from our technology consultants. Unfortunately, is that for a lot of our consultants, they've not been employed for such a long time before they come to work with us. Arguably, we have the most over-educated pizza delivery driver. He's based in Scotland now, but he was a pizza delivery driver, had a PhD, incredibly intelligent and amazing at what he does. But he was having to deliver pizzas because he couldn't get past a recruitment process, or even get past the CV round in organisations that would hire him for tech-based roles. So without Auticon, and without having a group that knew and understood about autism, he quite possibly would still be a pizza delivery driver, which is just an absolute waste of potential. I think the story always helps with that, of that kind of proof that that's not what's happening. And unfortunately, sometimes for our clients, seeing is believing, and working with our consultants and being supported by our job coaches on any challenges that might come up, they realise, rather than us just telling them that this doesn't have to be difficult, it doesn't have to be expensive, it's not overly complicated, but because there is so much fear about getting it wrong and just not knowing and understanding autism and neurodiversity, the easy option is just not to do it, and especially not proactively. So this is why, our tech consultants are now kind of embedded into our inclusion services of proof of concept that there's nothing to worry about, and they're really, really great at their job.
Yeah, I love that you have kind of an internal case study that you can show to clients to be like, see, it actually really works well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you shared, that some of your team members are hired out of from, 2+ years of unemployment. So, given kind of the rates of and underemployment in the neurodivergent community, how do you prepare people to re-enter the workforce?
Yeah, so the big selling point here for our consultants to feel confident enough to do that as well is our job coaches. So any consultant that comes to join us has a dedicated job coach that they see, at least in the beginning, especially at least once a week. They have them, on speed dial if they needed it. They're available on Teams chat. They'll have ad hoc conversations. And so in their coaching sessions, it might be that they're doing quite proactive work. The coach will be talking them through things to expect about the workplace, unwritten rules. If we know what project they're going on to and the type of environment, we do a workplace assessment to help reduce the anxiety, work with them on what accommodations they need, and so on, so that they would have the most support they've ever had for the most part, to make sure that it all goes well, and they keep hold of that job coach. Sometimes their job coach changes, but they will always have a job coach when they're an Auticon employee. And so we're not prescriptive. There isn't a big training program or anything that we have. Some countries have it, but at least in the UK, there isn't a training program or anything. But the coach will respond to what the person needs. And if and when they are in the workplace, if their client manager is feeding back that some things are not going so well, or that they're seeing particular challenges, the coach would feed that back to the individual, and they would work on those things together in coaching sessions. So, yeah, the coaching is the absolute secret sauce to that, for sure.
Incredible. I'm also wondering how you kind of navigate the biases and stigma that some of your clients may have against neurodivergent folks to ensure that there's a safer, a safe working environment for your consultants?
No consultant is allowed really to go into a client team until that client team's had training. So it used to be a 1 hour awareness session. We still do that, but we try to encourage our teams to have the kind of 4 hour very official modular training that we also sell separately and integrate into our inclusion services, because it's that much more in depth. But that is an absolute prerequisite for any client team. So they learn the foundations of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, what it's like to work with an autistic person, but also they have a briefing on that individual in particular. So we give the teams a heads up on things to avoid, for example, or things that we know would be challenging for that person, so that they aren't a challenge. An example is, for some consultants, some more than others, small talk isn't only boring, it's really, really painful and uncomfortable. So, we would let somebody know that if you wanted to talk about work or XYZ things, they'll sit down and they'll have the best conversation with you, and they'll be completely comfortable. But asking how was your weekend and what you're doing at the weekend, just don't. It's really fine to avoid it. Don't feel like you have to. So little tips like that. So again, it's that universal piece first, and then filtering it down to what's suitable for that person.
Incredible. Yeah. I'm also, wondering what the response has been to the services, especially the neuroinclusion services that auticon offers.
Yeah. No complaints so far.
Excellent.
Overall, very, very positive. I think there's a need just to have that someone hold their hand sometimes. I know that sounds a bit patronizing, but coming back to that feeling of overwhelm and feeling like there is a lot to think about, there's a lot to learn, it's a new topic on top of somebody's day job ultimately. It's a feeling that's overwhelming, not just because of the practical side, but the feeling of not knowing enough to do what's right, and be able to have those conversations, and to be even to carry out a neuroinclusion program. So we help to reduce that fear as much as we can.
And who are your role models in the neurodivergent space when you think about also your recent diagnosis, and who has helped you learn about yourself since then?
This was a good question. I was thinking about this, and it was probably the hardest one for me to prepare for and think about, because there are lots of influences now that are sharing their stories and their lived experience, and they're supporting people and other neurodivergent people and non-neurodivergent people to understand better. But honestly, the biggest role models for me are always the regular person, the mums that have suddenly realized the same as me that they had ADHD or they were on the spectrum. I can't really listen to one of the stories from our technology consultants without crying, because they finally feel like they found somewhere they can be themselves. And hearing about the struggles they'd had before them. And people in our client teams, they're coming forward and saying they finally realised that they've, things have clicked into place, and they've realised it and the difference that's made. And so, honestly, my role models are the everyday person that has been really, really struggling, and then they've had to go through a diagnosis later in life, or not had the support they've needed in life generally, and particularly in adulthood, and they've been able to find their way that makes sense for them.
Yes, I love that. Absolutely. And then, what are you working on right now? What exciting stuff is happening at auticon?
The biggest one is our e-learning and accreditation program at the moment. So right now we deliver all of our training mostly remotely because of COVID still, but in person when we can, because it's much more fun. But we are taking a lot of that content and putting into e-learning to make sure that we've got everything somebody could need, basically. If a workshop doesn't make sense, but they want something that's more scalable, then our e-learning will be the complement to that. And all of that e-learning and what we're doing for inclusion services will soon be accredited. So an individual or an organisation can get a kind of auticon accreditation for what they're doing and the work they're doing with us, which is, I would say personally, the thing I'm most excited about seeing come to life. Yeah.
Really, really cool. And what is next for you and for Auticon other than this amazing accreditation program?
Still lots of learning to do, to be honest. And we, as I say, we are global. We're much further ahead in the UK team just because of where understanding and awareness is. But every country is gearing up to be delivering neuroinclusion services. So I am very excited about that, because I know I'm biased, but I say, where the UK was 4 years ago, I can see what other countries are there right now, and they're inevitably going to and will have to catch up. So I'm excited to see that journey as it unfolds, rather than the UK version where we had to be quite reactive to fill the gap. But for me personally, I said to a colleague the other day, imagine where we are in 10 years. I am honestly so excited to be, with auticon in particular, to be very much involved in seeing how neurodiversity awareness is going to change over the next few years.
Yeah, I am so thrilled too. And I can definitely see, the 4 years behind thing in Denmark. And I'm really happy that, there's such great work happening in the US and the UK that we can kind of base what we're doing here on, and, that we can learn from as we go. So yeah, really happy folks and companies like yours exist. So thank you for the work you do.
No, thank you. Likewise to you. You guys are doing great work, especially with where you are at in Denmark. You're that little bit further ahead of what they realise is coming their way at the moment.
But that was actually all of my questions for today. Thank you so much for your time and capacity. So nice to talk to you and to connect. So yeah, I'm really, really happy we got to have this conversation.
You're welcome. It was great. Thank you very much.
And that's it for today, folks. Stay tuned for more interviews in the series. If you want to follow Kirsty's work, you can find her at Kirsty Cook on LinkedIn. If you want to follow our work, you can find us on all socials. We're at Timo App. And you can also reach out to us about any future speakers that you'd like to see, any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, either on socials or at community@timo.dk. Thank you so much, and see you next time.